Sonic, the heart of your system.
What's up guys, welcome back to another GGF video, and today we'll be taking a look at the brand new LIAN Li Q58 chassis. Now if you've been familiar with this case, you know it's been in the works for quite a while. I think at the start of the year and also mid of this year, LIAN Li have had their online digital expos and they've both been talking about this chassis. But it's finally here, it's going to hit the market very soon, and we have received both colours, the black and the white. As you saw at the start, I have done a water-cooled build because hey, it wouldn't be GGF if we don't custom water-cool the chassis. So before we look at the final build and all that, I want to sort of cover some of the specs of the case, the water cooling support and so on, so let's jump in. The Q58 is a sandwich style small form factor chassis with a volume of roughly 15 litres. Materials include aluminum exterior, SPCC steel for the internal structure and 3mm tempered glass for the side panels with dimensions of 250 high, 170 wide and 342 deep. Coming in two colour options, you'll find an all white model with powder coated front and top aluminum panels, and a full black model which has a two-tone aluminum front where the lower is brushed while the upper half and top panels are anodized in black. The chassis sits 21mm off the ground at the highest point and 11mm at its lowest point, which will definitely help with air intake as most of the bottom is ventilated. Side panels on the Q58 are quite interesting. By default, the shipped config has bottom halves consisting of mesh and top halves tempered glass. On the white model, there is no glass tint. All side panels have a hinged swing feature. The bottom panels swing down while the top panels swing up and are locked into place. Alternatively, you can just slide all the panels off while working in the chassis. Just be mindful you need to remove the top panel first before swinging the upper side panels. Side panels can be swapped around as well. For example, you can have both mesh panels on one side and both glass panels on the other, or glass at the bottom each side and mesh at the top each side. The only config you cannot have is glass at top on one side and glass on the bottom on the other side. This is just how the panels are made, and the locking tab will physically restrict doing this. Front I/O is located at the bottom left edge, and here you'll find a single USB Type A, USB Type C, audio combo jack and power button with LED. One thing I did find is that the internal cables for the front I/O are far too long. Another neat feature is the rear access fan and RGB hub. Definitely something I haven't seen in the small form factor case before, and whether you'll be using this or not will come down to the hardware you're running. Just to be clear, this is a 3 fan and 3 RGB hub, not a controller. The fan and RGB hub still need to be connected to a controllable source, which will most likely be your motherboard. And once again, I found these cables to be extremely long. The Q58 also supports ATX power supplies by installing the supplied bracket. This is very easy to do by removing the 240 bracket first and popping this one in, but of course some sacrifices had to be made. If going with an ATX PSU, you will limit the top cooling to either a 120mm all-in-one or a 120-140mm fan down from the 240mm support if going with an SFX unit. For storage, we find a few nifty options like a 2.5-inch hot swap bay on the inside of the front. I found this a good idea and works well. Being hot swap cables are already attached and about the right length, this bay can be removed if not being used. Another hard drive bracket can be found under the top 240 radiator bracket. This can either support one 2.5-inch SSD or one 3.5-inch hard drive. This can also be installed anywhere along the radiator bracket, but does prohibit the ability to install a 240 radiator or 2 fans in this area. The final place is a 2.5-inch SSD spot behind the PSU. Just make sure you install your drive first before installing your power supply. Cooling wise, we find support for a 120mm fan down the bottom under the PSU. I had no issues fitting in a standard 25mm thick 120mm fan in this area. Even larger GPUs would clear this fan due to it being slightly recessed in the bottom of the case. Fans can be installed on a neat tray which is accessed externally under the chassis. This is handy if you wish to add a fan later once the system is built. This removable tray can also support one 2.5-inch SSD if not going with a fan. The top of the Q58 can support a 240 or possibly a 280mm radiator or two 140mm fans. Now I said possibly for a 280mm radiator as there is roughly 305mm for radiator length. My test EK280 radiator is 320mm and would not install in the bracket, but some 280 radiators may come in at 305, so they may fit. Now this is if installing the radiator first, then fans, as the radiator has to actually fit into the bracket. If going the other way around, fans first in the bracket, then the radiator, we have a little bit more room. We now have 325mm for radiator length if removing that 2.5-inch hot swap SSD bay. I can slide the EK SE280 radiator in first, then drop the fans down, then the bracket. I was only able to align everything up with the port side above the PSU. One thing I do like about the top radiator bracket is that there are 3 sets of slits. Yes, at least 2 sets are needed to support 120 and 140 fan variants, but having 3 lots of equal slits gives you a few mounting options when installing a custom radiator. As you can see, this chassis isn't proportionally center in regards to the left and right sides, so favouring the radiator to one side makes it center to the components installed. Radiator and fan clearance is about 61mm from the top of the motherboard tray to the radiator bracket. Standard fans are 25mm, so that leaves 36mm for radiator thickness. In terms of GPU clearance, I was rather impressed here. Max length is 320mm, which gave me the ability to install the Power Color 6900 XT Red Devil, which is one of the largest cards around. And for another example, here is a smaller RTX 3080, which uses a reference PCB. And lastly, a shot of that same RTX 3080 on a Heatkiller water block. For GPU height, I had 210mm from the PCIe riser slot to the very top of the inside of the chassis. If installing standard fans at the top, I now had 185mm for GPU height, and if maxing up the radiator and fan space at the top, I now had 149mm for GPU height. Now that's most of the features on the Q58. Before we wrap this video up and cover temps and some few extra things, I know you're all dying to see the final build, so let's take a look. Now that is the final build there in the Q58. Now I was really impressed with how this build came out. I didn't showcase the filling in that bit of the B-roll section there, only because I do have a time-lapse build for this white build in the Q58. So I want to save it for that. I didn't want to give too much away on this case, but in saying that, I think you saw most of it just before. Now, a few things I want to wrap up. I did miss some few things. CPU cooler width. So if you are going with something like an air cooler in this chassis, you have roughly 66mm from the CPU out to the side panel. Now, another thing I didn't really cover was res support. Now you can see here, I've got a Bitspower. This is a DDC pump res combo. The res on top is about 60mm. That includes the top little cap. Now, there are some other options you can go about a pump res combo. Ideally, this is the only spot I would suggest putting a pump res combo. You could go something like those Alphacool, real small DCLT, the little ones. You could put them pretty much anywhere, but I wanted to go with a dedicated res just to make it easier to fill, and it does look a lot better on film as well. Now, I kind of cheated a bit because I did go with a really small GPU. In saying that, it is a 3080, it is a reference, and reference cards are much smaller. Don't be fooled by reference cards and their coolers. Sometimes the coolers can overhang 1-2 inches or so on. This card is very, very short. It's only 230mm. I had roughly 320mm from one end to the other end of the, there's a bit of an IO block here for the front IO, and that's where it actually hits. If you were really desperate, you could remove that front IO block and you would get about 10 or 20 more millimeters. But yeah, I had about 90mm to play with, which was enough room for this. You could go with something like, this is an EK FLT 80. This is one of their new ones. They're the 80mm ones. So this is 80 wide. I would suggest mounting it like this after the GPU. So GPU's here, mount it here like this, and then you'd be able to have the ports out the side. You wouldn't get the ports at the front because you don't have enough depth in fitting a pump res. For depth, if you wanted to fit something, say from the middle section out towards the chassis, you've got about 67 millimeters for a pump or a res in that area. So that's just some options there, but with those measurements I've given you there, you can pretty much do the maths and work it out from there. Now, just comparing the Q58 to some other cases, I'll start from your right to left. So we have my Ghost S1 build, a very, very popular build I did recently. Now, for you guys who have been asking, I do have a mod video on how I went about that whole build. So if you guys hang in there, I will release that. So yeah, we got the Ghost S1 with the dual hat, so the top hat, then the S1 chassis, then the bottom hat. Now we have the Q58, and then we have the S1 without any hats, and that's just a sort of a visual size comparison rather than just throwing measurements at you. Now, jumping into Temps. Now, this is a gaming build, so I've done gaming only Temps. Haven't really bothered doing Prime 95 for an hour or so on, because this is a slim 30mm 240 radiator. This is a 3080, and it is a 11600K. Ideally, I would have liked a 3070 and something like a 5600X, but I must admit this motherboard looks so damn good from the Gigabyte, that's a Z590i Vision. They don't do one in the AMD, so I had to go, I think 11600K. I could have gone a little bit lower, but I wanted to have something decent for gaming. And in terms of the 3080, as I said, 3070 would have been best, but unfortunately there's not many blocks for 3070s, and I'm pretty sure they don't even make a reference PCB for a 3070. They're all aftermarket. So jumping at Temps, I'm not going to go through each game and so on. I'm just going to throw them up now and talk over them. But yeah, I had the fans. These are the LIAN Li Unifans, the original ones, the SLs. Now these were running at about 1200 RPM. Now this system was very, very quiet. I didn't have the fans thrashing out. I didn't have the pump full bore because this is a DDC. DDC pumps are very powerful. This is a small loop. So I had that turned down to about 65, 70%. Now I ran these games for about 45 minutes. So I was just playing along, and those are the Temps. Now you might be thinking, hey, these are a little bit toasty, but yeah, they are getting warm. But in saying that, the GPU was recording around 320 watts and the CPU was about 120 or so. And so that's quite a lot of heat output for this tiny little radiator. Now, in terms of how I had the panels positioned, I didn't have it like this. I only have it like this to showcase that the glass can only be hinged, or the glass stays up the top. If you put the mesh up the top, you can't secure the mesh in to hold it up in this fancy sort of wing style layout. There's no tabs to hold the mesh up here. So if you do put the mesh up here, it's just gonna fall straight back down. So I just have it like this. But in terms of temp testing, I had the mesh up the top because I think that would work best for the fans because you're gonna get the closest air input. And then I had the glass down the bottom. But yeah, temps weren't too bad all up. Ideally, as I said, you could have gone a little bit lower spec, but that's what I had and that's what I went with. Now I want to talk about my build because I'm sure a lot of you guys are going to ask how I went about this. I spent a few days planning this because I wanted to do something a little bit special after my recent Ghost S1 build. Everyone has been talking about that and sort of pretty much saying how well done it was and the process I did with the panels and so on. So in this build, I went with 4 separate little panels. They're all on your side. So I've got a panel directly behind the GPU. I've got another panel behind the pump res combo. I've got a panel down the very bottom that covers the black PCI Express slot. And then I've got a panel that is more over towards the PSU side, because in this chassis, you've got the PSU, you've got that little gap for an SSD, and then you have that middle wall. So by putting the panel on this side, then the little panel on the PSU side, kind of gave you that cavity, and that's where I put things like extra cables. I've actually installed a little screen. For those of you who saw, these are little round screens about the size, basically the same size as a watch screen. They just go to a HDMI controller board. Had these for a while and I've never had a use to use one, and while I was planning out this build, I thought I had a bit of space around the pump res combo, so I'm like, why not just drill a hole and I can put this screen behind it. So bulking up those panels a little bit higher, cleaned up all that mess because the controller board is about that big and I didn't want that sticking out in sight. But yeah, once again, these panels are about 1.2 millimeter thick aluminum, cut them all down to size, and then I vinyl wrapped each side, and that's pretty much it. I needed to do so many panels because the actual whole chassis isn't just one wall in the middle, it's actually stepped off. So you've got one bit and then about halfway it steps out a bit, and there's no way I would have got that sharp bend to do that. But I think the panels make a world of difference, because without that, you would have just seen a lot of different areas. You would have seen the white behind it all, but there were a lot of holes, and you would have also seen all the cables behind the motherboard. Now, I just want to talk about cables. I did say earlier they were very, very long. I'm not sure if LIAN Li are going to look into those to make them shorter. The only cable I did remove was the audio front panel cable. I don't use that, so that could actually be ripped out from the connector. And I did use all the others, and I did plug them in. I found it was best to route them along and then bulk them up behind the motherboard, then drop the motherboard down on top, and then you can't see them on this side because that panel behind the GPU is hiding all those cables. And also with the power connector up here, now being a SFF unit, it is over up the top over here. It does have to have this extension cable that routes it along. By default, it runs along here, it runs down the side and into the PSU. What I did, I ran it down directly behind this plate along the bottom, and then it comes up the side up here and then in. It's quite hard to explain, but I think that did work out really good, and you don't just see this white cable running along. Now that's quite a bit I've covered there talking about that. Another issue I ran into, this was very, very last minute. Now I was going to go with the LIAN Li power supply. They do have their 750 and 850 watts. I did order custom cables on it, but when they arrived 3 days ago, and they were not the right type. So whoever I got my sources from for the OEM for those units weren't right, and there was no way I was going to get those cables to run because they were the wrong pinout. Now I did have the right sizes for those because I ordered a few different sets of the same cable just so I had some different lengths to play with. So I had to scourge around and find what I had around and use a Silverstone unit, and I managed to find some pretty decent cables that were roughly the right length. I think the 24 pin might be a little bit long, but I think overall it did turn out pretty good. And I am pushing the guys at Cable Mod to produce some white SFF cables. So you know they've released their black, they've got the clear, which I used in this build, and they're also looking at doing white, and I really tried to push that for this build, but they have been a little bit delayed. But I will do a build once they do white cables, and I think that would really top this build off. Now I think that is pretty much it for everything about this case. I want to cover price. Now there's 4 versions all up. There's the black and white, and then you've got the Gen 3 and Gen 4, so that makes the 4 versions. For the Gen 3 in US dollars, the black is $129 and the white is $139, so $10 extra for the white. And for the Gen 4, that is the PCI Express riser cable, you're looking at $159 for the black and $169 for the white. So once again, $10 difference. This seems to be pretty much the standard with the LIAN Li and their white cases. They always have that $10 variance for the white version because I think there's a little bit more work involved at getting that chassis in white. Now, the reason why I do like this case, I think it's just something a bit different. Now, I haven't had a lot of experience in these small form factor cases. I am really interested in them, and I'm pretty keen to do more of these in the future. I think this is probably like my 3rd or 4th build, but to me, I think this is just something different. It's unique. It's got these fancy hinge design, but once you do get them tight and you move it once, they do fall back down, so you do have to tighten them back up again. It does have that fan hub over here. Now, one thing I do want to cover about this, it's going to be tough because I did shorten all my cables. For the Unifan cables, I do have my port here. I made these cables about this long. I actually opened up the little Unifan little connector cable that attaches onto the fan. I desoldered the LIAN Li proprietary connector, and I soldered on a standard 5 volt 3-pin RGB cable. So by doing that, I could avoid using the LIAN Li black controller hub for their fans because there was no way I would be able to put that in the case. And by adding a standard 5 volt RGB connector, I could then use the standard hub that is built into the back of the case. And then I also shortened the cable for the fan, and I just found some white. I actually found a fan that had white cables for the RGB and for the fan cable, and I just cut them off and soldered them onto this fan plug here. So that really helped there, and you can see once I pull that down, it's just the right length, because if you didn't, it'd be pretty hard because you're going to have to zip tie the cables up and leave them right there, and you would pretty much see them coming from both angles. Now in terms of this little screen, as I said at the start, I've had these for a little while. This is a 400 by 400 pixel. I'm not even sure what size it is. Like, this is a comparison to my watch, pretty much the same size as a watch screen. And I've had these for a while, and I've been really wanting to use them in a build. And once again, I just drilled a round hole until I got about the right size I wanted. The hole is a little bit smaller, than the screen because I wanted it to completely cover the size of the hole. Now in terms of connecting these do come with a HDMI controller board. If you are ordering these, I'll put a link to AliExpress where I get these from. It's kind of confusing because there's a few options for these screens. You can get the screen itself, the board itself, or both. And now I have done this in the past where I've just ordered the screen. You've got to make sure you get the screen and the board, and sometimes there might be other options as well, but just make sure you do get the one with the board because literally you cannot use this screen just like this. It's like a little proprietary connector and you do need the controller board. And then I just ran a HDMI cable that runs into the back, straight into the GPU. And then for the software I was running, once again, I was running AquaSuite. Now I've been using that quite a bit and I just think that is by far the best monitoring system, and visually it just looks the best as well. Now you might be running, hey, I don't have any Aqua computer hardware running in this PC. Well, that's because I don't. To install the software, you just have to have a device that it will pick up. So I just have one of their Octos, I plug it into USB, install the software, remove that device, and then you can continue setting up your sensor panel and you can just link it in to something like HW Info 64, and then you don't have to worry about running their hardware to keep that software going. So that's pretty neat as well. Now that's pretty much it. I don't want to talk on and on and on because this is still a review on this chassis. And the last thing I want to do is shout out to Heatkiller and Bitspower. It was very last minute I decided to go with Heatkiller because I haven't been using them for a long time. They've got new blocks, their new radiators and so on, and then Bitspower as well, which I've been using for a long time. Now for availability on this case, I don't know just yet, but I'll throw the links down in the description and you'll be able to click on those and it'll have your pre-order and so on. But yeah, that's it for this video. I want to thank LIAN LI for sending both of these out. Hope you enjoyed this video and make sure you stay tuned for that time-lapse video, which I'll probably drop in about 24 hours time. So I'll see you next time.